The Royal Commission has now resumed. Please be seated.
Ms Hogan-Doran, nice jacket.
Thank you,
Please
Chair.
proceed.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Commissioners. In the course of opening on Monday, I referred to the large amount of material that has been tendered in chambers between 4 September and 21 September. As an aid memoir to you, Commissioners, of course you've seen this material, but also for the assistance of parties and the public, I'm just going to provide a brief overview of that material because it totals something in the order of 15,543 pages. All this material is now published on the Royal Commission website under Hearing Block 4. The written outline of this address, which includes the relevant exhibit and document codes for each of the documents I mentioned specifically, will also be uploaded for the assistance of parties with leave and the general public. So the first is and this should take about 10 minutes, Chair. The first is the tender.
No, that's okay. Take your time because I think it's worthwhile parties understanding exactly what's in there rather than have to troll through it.
And particularly because the way that a number of the documents are identified, they're identified by reference to the number of the notice, the compulsory notice, and so it can be difficult to understand what is the content of the response from a particular state or federal government without this assistance. So the material tendered on 4 September 2020 was comprised mostly of material received from the Commonwealth, state and territory agencies in response to notices. That included some 3,440 pages of material. Those responses to notices from the Commonwealth departments and agencies included information provided on topics of relevance to our terms of reference, including first, from the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profit Commission concerning charitable fundraising regulation. Second, from the Australian Reinsurance Pool Corporation on the operation of its reinsurance scheme and analogies between terrorism reinsurance and possible reinsurance schemes for natural hazard risks such as cyclones. Third, from the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment on the impact of the 2019-2020 bushfires and floods on primary producers and support available. Fourth, from the Australian Heritage Council on the impacts of bushfire on heritage sites and the protection of those sites. Next, from the Australian Transport Safety Bureau on challenges encountered in relation to aircraft use in coordinating and responding to bushfires. Next, the Department of Finance in relation to funding for aerial firefighting and preparedness for natural disaster risks. From the Department of the Treasury in relation to insurance arrangements, insurance regulation I should say, and also charitable fundraising regulation. From the Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Communications in relation to emergency communications during natural disasters. From the Department of Social Services in relation to its role in supporting relief and recovery activities following a natural disaster. From Services Australia in relation to the provision of financial assistance following natural disasters and the sharing of information and data between services providing assistance. From the Civil Aviation Safety Authority Chair in relation to airspace management arrangements for aerial firefighting and the regulation of unmanned aircraft such as drones. From the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet and the Digital Transformation Agency in relation to work being undertaken in relation to information, data and natural disasters. Commissioners, there's a number of responses from the Department of Defence in relation to requests for Commonwealth assistance in relation to national emergencies, including the operation of the Defence Assistance to the Civil Community Framework, where there is a potential for the Australian Defence Force in firefighting, and the activities undertaken by Defence in the response to and recovery from the 2019-2020 bushfires. From the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, DFAT, in relation to the Australian Humanitarian Partnership and DFAT's role in relation to natural disasters domestically, including offers and requests for international assistance. From the National Indigenous Australians Agency on Indigenous fire management, and also, Commissioners, a number of early responses from the Department of Home Affairs, Emergency Management Australia, which had not been previously tendered, in relation to a number of topics on which you have, Commissioners, already heard extensive evidence. That includes Commonwealth emergency management arrangements, frameworks and plans, the provision of financial assistance to the states and territories, emergency warning and communication systems, critical infrastructure resilience, as well as the bushfire resilience star rating and the Disaster Watch app. which I might note is no longer in operation. Also tendered were state and territory responses to notices to give information relating to the responsibility for and oversight by the state governments, state and territory governments, for the capacity and capability of local governments and their role in responding to and recovering from natural disasters. These responses also included information on a number of capability building projects, as well as resource sharing arrangements between local governments. States and territories also provided clarifications of oral evidence that was given and responses to questions that were taken on notice during the hearings. Also tendered was a response to a notice to give information by, in particular, the West Australian State Emergency Management Committee. Commissioners, central to paragraph E of your terms of reference, the tender also includes the completion of tender of reports of state and territory inquiries into the 2019-2020 bushfire season. That is that the ACT, the New South Wales and Victorian inquiries to which I made reference in my opening on Monday. The tender also included responses to notice to produce from the Commonwealth, State and Territories in relation to their consideration of the findings and recommendations of previous reports and inquiries into natural disaster arrangements and the adequacy or extent of implementation of those findings or recommendations. The tender further included some various documents produced by Commonwealth, State and Territory agencies, such as briefings or observations provided by the Bureau of Meteorology and Geoscience Australia, and a number of evacuation guidelines from state and territories and local governments. Also on 4 September 2020 was tendered further material received from local governments, including one statement correcting oral evidence and a question taken on notice by Moreton Bay Regional Council. It also included a response to a notice to give information by Lismore City Council in relation to the My Roads Info app and website, which combined data from New South Wales Live Traffic, Queensland Traffic and Vic Roads with local road information to provide a view of the region's roads. And Commissioners, you might recall earlier evidence in relation to state road closure apps stopping at borders. Finally, it included a response to a notice to give information from Dr Thomas Duff on challenges in bushfire management. So, Commissioners, though much of that material had been available to the Office of the Royal Commission and Council assisting in the preparation of the draft propositions, not all of it had been, but to the extent it was available, it was thought to be taken into account. Then there was additional material tendered on and from 14 September, and the intent of making that material available to the parties, in particular the state and territory governments and the Commonwealth Government, was to have it in advance of this hearing block, and the request as to whether they would seek to address you orally. The material tendered on 14 September 2020 involved a further tranche of material in preparation for the release of our responses to our draft propositions. It contained material from a variety of sources and related to a number of different topic areas relevant to your terms of reference, on which hearings have previously been held and evidence previously received. Commissioners included 4,470 pages of material. Included within that tender were responses to notice to give information received from the following: the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience, together with key documents published by the AIDA, such as a series of major incident reports and the Australian Disaster Resilience handbooks. Commissioners, you'll note that AIDA explains in its response its role in delivering programs on behalf of the Commonwealth Government to support a disaster-resilient Australia. Material also was received from the Consumer Action Law Centre in relation to insurance, on the impact of bushfires on flora and fauna, ecological communities and matters of national environmental significance, received from Professor Alan York, Professor Chris Dickman and Professor Hugh Possingham. On land management and hazard reduction from Professor Heather Keith. On Indigenous land practices from the Federation of Victorian Traditional Owner Corporations, and finally on the impact of the 2019-2020 bushfires and floods on primary producers from the Tasmanian Farmers and Graziers Association, the New South Wales Farmers and the Queensland Farmers Federation and Primary Producers SA. Commissioners, also included in that tender, I'll just call out some specific documents, the Australian Government's 2015 National Climate Resilience and Adaptation Strategy, a number of previous reviews or inquiries, such as the 2014 Australian National Audit Office report into the Emergency Defence Assistance to the Civil Community, DAC, a letter from Telstra to the Office of Royal Commission, which provided some additional information in relation to the matters that were raised during the hearings on 2 and 3 July in relation to telecommunications, and also the experience of rural fire brigades. There was also included supplementary and updated submissions and notices to give responses, including from the Salvation Army and the Business Council of Australia, and publications by the Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC on the role of pharmacists, and bushfire risk fact sheets that have been prepared by the Insurance Australia Group, IAG. Tranche on 16 September 2020, that material tendered then was provided in response to what were called the whole of government notices to the states and territories. It included 857 pages of written material answering those questions. The tendered responses covered a variety of topics, including the following: A, protections available for employees, employers and volunteers in responding to a natural disaster. B, fire and emergency services and resource sharing, including registers of personnel, current personnel capacity and numbers, deployments based on predictive modelling, scenario testing and joint exercises, and the integration of private firefighters. The use of remotely piloted aircraft systems in natural disasters. That was C. D, planning for evacuations and communication of evacuation plans. E, responsibility for identifying and maintenance of evacuation centres and neighbourhood safer places, and differences in national terminology for sheltering options. F, recovery assistance measures provided for the 2019-2020 bushfires. G, the collection and reporting of impact data. H, recovery training programs and exercises. I, insurance for government-owned public infrastructure. J, national parks and forestry, including firefighting and hazard reduction skills and arrangements in place with adjacent or proximate landowners. K, experiences with seeking assistance from the ADF during the 2019-2020 bushfires and the standard processes for requests under ComDis plan. L, the review of interstate post-action inquiries and the sharing of the state or territory's post-action inquiries with other jurisdictions. And M, from Tasmania, health and air quality information, noting, Commissioners, you'd already received evidence on those topics from the other states and territories. And then the tender on 18 September 2020 was material that had been provided to the Commission by AFAC. It included 1,362 pages of material. In particular, Commissioners, there were 3 statements provided by the CEO of AFAC, Mr Stuart Ellis, who you will recall we heard from in the first hearing block. He addressed a number of topics for us, including the governance and accountability arrangements for AFAC, the National Resource Sharing Centre and the National Aerial Firefighting Centre, as well as the Australian Bushfire Fuel Classification System. He also gave us his impressions on the extent to which the national arrangements reflect the vision he and his co-authors set out for 2020 in their 2004 report to COAG on bushfire mitigation management. The tender also included a number of documents relating to work undertaken by or under the auspices of AFAC, which I note indicate the breadth of that work, including the AFAC Strategic Directions Achievement Report, minutes of the AFAC Board, minutes of the AFAC Risk and Audit Committee, and minutes of the National Aerial Firefighting Centre Strategic Committee. And then the tender on the morning of 21 September, which was only just Monday. Feels a little longer, a while ago than that. The material tendered on 21 September was comprised mostly of material received from the Commonwealth, State and Territory agencies in response to notices, but also some non-government documents and responses. It included 5,414 pages of material and covered various topics relevant to your terms of reference. The responses to notices to give information from Commonwealth departments and agencies included A, from the Department of Home Affairs in relation to various topics of relevance, including protection of critical infrastructure, the conduct of risk assessments and defence assistance to the civil community, in particular in the context of a power to declare a state of national emergency. The Department of Home Affairs Commissioners also provided a supplementary statement from Secretary Michael Pizzullo, AO, about the National Coordination Mechanism task forces and working groups. B, from the Department of Defence in relation to the powers, privileges and immunities afforded to ADF members when carrying out DAC deployments and in relation to the legal framework for DAC arrangements. C, from the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet and in relation to the legal framework for DAC arrangements, further information concerning the Commonwealth's proposed power to declare a state of national emergency. And finally, from Graham Hawke from the Bureau of Meteorology in relation to briefs provided by the Bureau to the Commissioners and Chief Officers Strategic Committee, COSC, including the October 2019 meeting which he attended in Hobart, Tasmania. That was the subject of the video evidence in Hearing Block 3. The tender also includes, amongst the documents, a draft item of Commonwealth legislation. I referred to one piece of legislation, the Defence Amendments. This is the draft Data Availability and Transparency (Consequential Amendments) Bill 2020 and the associated consultation paper. That, of course, is relevant to Parts D and potentially Part E of the propositions. Also tendered from states and territories were various documents produced or published by states and territories, including, for example, their climate change adaptation strategies, their climate change strategies and their emergency management capability frameworks. B, their responses to questions taken on notice during the hearing and other questions specific to states and territories and their emergency management frameworks. C, responses to notices to give information in relation to the meetings of state and territory strategic level emergency management committees during the 2019-2020 bushfires. Responses to notices to give information in relation to the impact of the 2019-2020 bushfires and floods on primary producers and the support available to them. Responses to notice to give information in relation to funding for firefighting and emergency services. From the State of Victoria, a response to a notice to give information in relation to the standing up of their new recovery agency, the Bushfire Recovery Victoria, which we heard some evidence about in, I think, Hearing Block 2. From the ACT, its whole of government response, and that, could I just note, that ACT response is the response to whole of government is the ACT's response, which was otherwise all the group had been tendered on, I think, 14 September. 16 September, sorry, I would correct that. From the state of Tasmania in relation to the scenarios to measure regulatory settings relating to their natural hazard risk management. Commissioners, you'll recall you received some evidence about that from the other states and territories, but not Tasmania at that time. Included in the tender was also responses to notice to give information received from joint initiatives of the Australian state and territory governments, including first, the Australian Building Codes Board in relation to the National Construction Code and building standards and requirements for resilience to natural disasters, and B, the Environmental Health Standing Committee of the Australian Health Protection Principal Committee, or AHPPC, on work that is being progressed in relation to a nationally consistent framework for health messaging in relation to smoke events. The tender also included responses to compulsory notice to give information in relation to emergency response and recovery for wildlife affected by bushfire from Wildlife Health Australia and Animal Health Australia. And finally, Commissioners, the tender also includes a number of other publications relevant to your terms of reference. And for example, included in the tender is a discussion paper from the Charitable Fundraising National Working Group on Charitable Fundraising in Australia, the proposed cross-border recognition model for charitable fundraisers, the final report and recommendations of the National Bushfire and Climate Summit 2020, and finally a report by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute titled Preparing for an Era of Disasters. Commissioners, that material indicates the breadth of the terms of reference and a very sustained effort by those within the Commission and those assisting the Commission at state, federal, territory and local government, and of course right across civil society and the public in assisting you in giving effect to your terms of reference and your letters pattern.
I appreciate that summary, and also do want to thank all those that have put the effort into it, especially in that last tranche of the the relatively quick turnaround and the responses. If I do my maths, that's up around about 70,000 pages of tendered documents that we have had to consider, and it's a full breadth in national coordination. So it has helped the commissioners immensely in being able to work towards recommendations that will be out on the 28th of October. So thank you for summarising that last tranche.
And also, Commissioner, Chair, if I may say, that material all being made available on the website means it is available, of course, as a public record for the nation in the future.
No, that's exactly right, and that's also important as well for people to reference. Thank you.
Commissioners, today we will test the draft propositions with our final two witnesses from the Commonwealth. As I outlined in my opening on Monday, the purpose of this exercise is to ascertain how we can best arrange and coordinate national efforts for the future, particularly in the face of an increasingly complex, compounding and cascading disaster landscape. The areas of the draft propositions that we propose to test are Section B, National Coordination and Accountability Arrangements, Section H, the Standalone National Resilience and Recovery Agency, and also Section C, briefly concerning the declaration of a national emergency. The two witnesses today are returning witnesses, Philip Gaetjens, the Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and Mr Andrew Colvin, who is the National Coordinator of the National Bushfire Recovery Agency and former Commissioner of the Australian Federal Police. They'll be giving their evidence as a panel, and I call Mr Gaetjens and Mr Colvin.
Mr Gaetjens, Mr Colvin, thank you for taking the time this morning. We appreciate it very, very much. It's good to see you both again.
Good morning. Thank you.
Mr Gaetjens and Mr Colvin will both affirm. Thank you, Associate.
Mr Gaetjens, do you solemnly and sincerely declare and affirm that the evidence you shall give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. Mr Colvin, do you solemnly and sincerely declare and affirm that the evidence you shall give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us again and assisting the Commission in its work. What I wanted to do today, gentlemen, is just to focus on the propositions and the Commonwealth's response, and just to seek some clarification of the matters. Some of your, to the extent you're able to respond to the evidence of Mr Jennings, the Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which was given on Tuesday. And also Mr Colvin will be seeking an update from you on the work of the MBRA and, of course, the Commission's consideration of a proposal that there be a standing resilience, relief and recovery agency. But if I might just turn to you first, Mr Gaetjens, if we could have propositions B3 to B5 brought up, which proposed revisions to natural disaster plans operator, that's RCN 900 137 0001. Now, gentlemen, I'm hoping these will be displayed for you. You won't need to have that. You should be able to read them, but please do let me know if you have any difficulties. The improvements that were proposed in Section B are matters requiring coordination between and collaboration by, and essentially the working together of the Commonwealth and the several states and territories in the national interest. In the Commonwealth's response to propositions B3 to B5, which concerned the need for revision of national disaster plans, the Commonwealth confirmed that there is a review underway to NatCat Displan and ComDisplan. My question is this: those plans sit within the Australian Government Crisis Management Framework. Now, that management framework is authorised, Mr Gaetjens, by the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and that was last updated in December 2017. Is the review purely in relation to those two plans, which admittedly are the ones we called out, or is it the review of the framework within those plans? Sorry, I withdraw that. The framework within which those plans operate.
I may have to come back with further information on that. I had concentrated mainly on National Cabinet, but I can get back to the Royal Commission very quickly this afternoon, I'm sure.
All right.
With respect to that particular proposition, because again, I don't wish to gloss over this, and I want to make sure that we provide you with as much assistance as we can.
Okay,
No.
we'll take it that way, I think.
No, that's fine. Can I say the Commissioners, one of the strengths and weaknesses of the draft propositions is that they were not necessarily given a context in which they were being presented, and there are elements of the responses that then draw out a need to go back and see how broad things such as reviews of this kind are.
That's right, and based on all the tendered evidence and what's happened this week, we're obviously moving on as well and
That's right.
trying to resolve some other issues. So, no, Mr. Gaetjens, that'd be quite okay if you can get back to us on that this afternoon, please.
Mr. Gaetjens,
We will do that as quickly as we can.
what I might do is I'll move ahead to the National Cabinet considerations so that we can deal with that matter of substance first. Can I have propositions B9 to 11 brought up, Operator, please? B9 to 11 concerned the question of the role for National Cabinet in natural disasters. And as I said in my opening on Monday, the propositions sought to reflect the success of National Cabinet during the COVID-19 pandemic, and it suggested the proposition took up the suggestion that the National Cabinet might be the recipe for success in the future when applied to natural disasters. The Commonwealth did not indicate whether it supported in principle or did not support propositions 9 to 11, but it does make the point that National Cabinet is not the appropriate body for decision making for responding to national natural disasters, and instead suggested that that function should be tasked to a subordinate body of responsible ministers in each jurisdiction, either reporting to the National Cabinet or the National Federation Reform Council. Could I just invite you, Mr. Gaetjens, just to expand on that? When there is referred to the subordinate body, is that MCPEM, the Ministerial Council, or whatever will be its substitute or replacement?
Council, the proposition that was put, I think, very well responded to the role of National Cabinet in the COVID-19 pandemic. The Commonwealth's further response is providing greater, probably a wider focus on National Cabinet, and I think it is trying to do two things there. One is to say that National Cabinet has agendas that are set by National Cabinet itself, and it is seeking to clearly differentiate the roles of other committees, of officials or ministers, in fact, that relate to a particular event or matter that, in the nature of subsidiarity and closeness to the issues, are best placed to make operational decisions. National Cabinet can, if it wished to get involved, be a very good coordination body for high-level issues, but it would not seek, I think, to be involved in the operational matters that the experts and the people on the ground are best prepared and positioned to do.
All right. And the distinction that is made in the Commonwealth's response is that it's not appropriate body for decision making for responding to national natural disasters. Very much, as you say, those operational, tactical questions. And I don't think it was intended that that would be the role for National Cabinet. But what role do you see it as having for? Is there space for it to have a role in setting policy that would be relevant to national natural disasters?
Councillor, it could have a role, I think, if I look at the COVID, if it's approached in COVID, it has been a very useful coordination and information sharing mechanism because, again, states have powers under their Public Health Acts to do things. The Commonwealth has its powers to do things, and it allows knowledge sharing of what is to be done probably before that is publicly known, so there is an awareness. and that can improve coherence of outcomes that incorporate both Commonwealth and state responses. It can look at upcoming events. There was a briefing to National Cabinet by the Bureau of Meteorology, for example, so that provides a useful forum for everyone to be involved at a high level. Again, I'm sure that fire commissioners and emergency management ministers were probably briefed in more detail with respect to issues, but it provides a very good forum for people to be given information at one time. The national position, and again, with respect to the Bureau of Meteorology briefing, there were clear implications, I think, for Queensland, where there was a higher cyclone risk, and some particular states had a higher, if my memory is correct, a higher bushfire risk in Western Australia, and probably a normal risk in the eastern states. So it does provide an opportunity so that leaders of jurisdictions can get a perspective of their own jurisdiction, as well as those either who are neighbours or the rest of the country. So I think it does provide a useful planning mechanism and information sharing mechanism that improves the coherence, if you like, of the outcome from National Cabinet.
I understand. In the response to Proposition B12, which was concerning policy projects at the Commonwealth, at the national level, if we could just have B12, the response that is given by the Commonwealth in the responses to the draft proposition, so this is in the table, had a slightly different focus, and it said that the National Cabinet is driven by a singular agenda to create jobs. And the answer there is different in that this additional information is given in the context of policy projects. Could you just explain what was being sought to be conveyed there, Mr. Gaetjens, as you understand it?
Thank you, Council. The National Cabinet, in fact, has evolved over time. When it was established on the 13th of March, subsequent to a COAG meeting, and then met on the 15th of March, it was fairly and squarely focused on health responses to stopping the spread, flattening the curve, and basically providing measures that would allow Australia's health system to build up and make sure that the capacity was available if an emergency and crisis situation responded, which required the availability of many hospital beds, ventilators, ICU beds, and related things. By the time of the caseload emerging, my memory is on May the 8th, in fact, National Cabinet considered a plan then, because case numbers were dropping down, and on a health basis things were going fairly well, and at that stage the National Cabinet focused on a plan and a three-step plan to reopen the economy, knowing of course that even though it was a health aspect, it had enormous economic consequences because of the supply side impact it was having, and in fact the demand side impact it was having, because people were not allowed to move around. So on May the 8th, there was this agreement to a plan to reopen the economy. And then on the 29th of May, just to give some specificity with respect to dates,
Please.
The National Cabinet confirmed, in fact, that COAG would be ended and National Cabinet would replace that former architecture, if you like, for Commonwealth-state relations. On that meeting of the 29th, and I'll quote from the Prime Minister's press conference transcript, which said, "Now, how it will be different to the way COAG worked is the National Cabinet will be driven by a singular agenda, and that is to create jobs. And the National Cabinet will drive the reform process between state and federal cooperation to drive jobs." I did mention in my earlier evidence as well that the National Cabinet could play a role in coordinating decision-making related to recovery following a natural disaster.
Yes.
And that would be consistent with National Cabinet's role in dealing with COVID-19, both as it continues to require ongoing response and in transitioning from health responses to reopening the economy. So, Council, that statement about jobs was an evolution that occurred within National Cabinet as the circumstances changed with respect to health, allowed the economy to reopen, and then jobs will be a critical underlying factor of the country's economic recovery.
So just to recap, you've identified planning, information sharing, recovery, and a policy-driven work concerning jobs and within the framework of that broader recovery work. Is there any, in relation to your earlier evidence concerning National Cabinet not having a role in operational decision making, what of setting the overall strategy or resolving issues as between the states and territories and bringing those kinds of the strategic response to a national natural disaster to a national level? Is that still contemplated that would be only at a First Minister's level? Or is there do you anticipate some kind of mechanism that in an appropriate case it could be elevated, or aspects of issues could be still be elevated to the National Cabinet if necessary?
Council, my assessment would be that National Cabinet would focus on those things that have a national focus and become a national priority.
I see.
So again, I think we are talking about scalability with respect to those issues that can be handled by ministerial councils and they themselves are being reviewed. Mr Conran is reviewing the councils that existed under COAG and the need for them to continue. But just as, again, COVID I think is a good example. If COVID did not have the capacity to spread, it's very infectious, so there was a national risk that with people travelling, it could affect the economy very, very quickly. So I think it would be scalable, and I wouldn't like to put a definition to a scale, but it's when there is an assessment by the leaders, and I think they have a fairly good sense of when they need to actually interact and intervene in matters and draw things to their own attention.
I see.
That is reflected in National Cabinet's very firm, I think, expectation that they will decide what comes up to the National Cabinet agenda. Mm-hmm. And it also allows them to feel the breeze, if you like, that says their sense, and I can't underestimate that sense, because they get around and speak to a lot of people, they've got a lot of experience, and sometimes they can see things at a higher level and a combined national picture that give rise to get something on their radar perhaps before ministers or other groups can.
And is that perhaps a function, at least in part, because ultimately those First Ministers and the Prime Ministers are the ones who must be accountable to the public?
They are definitely accountable, Council, and I think they feel that very strongly and do not wish to be reacting to events. They wish to be prepared to manage events and quickly, and I think that was a clear outcome from community responses in the bushfires, is people wanted to see action very quickly.
Just before we pass from this topic, you've mentioned the review that's going on of the councils and other arrangements that had previously sat under COAG. Could you give us an update on the progress of that review and those reforms? What is the timeline for that work to be completed?
That work is very near completion at the moment, Council. I think it would be expected to be reviewed by National Cabinet in the next meeting or two.
how often does National Cabinet meet? It meets each Friday.
Its next meeting is on the 16th of October, Council.
16th of October, meets monthly. All right.
In fact, it did have a fortnightly session, but in fact, the next fortnightly Friday was the Friday before the national budget.
It is,
so
indeed.
The Prime Minister did not want to be distracted at that time, and the National Cabinet agreed that its next meeting would be on the 16th of October.
What we've seen in the experience of COVID-19 and also to some extent the bushfires and the other disasters that followed, such as the hailstorms and the flooding, that natural disasters can have a significant effect on the national economy. Is the National Cabinet well placed to deal with, in particular, those impacts of national natural disasters, or just natural disasters more generally?
Council, during National Cabinet, there were several briefings from the Reserve Bank Governor and the Head of Commonwealth Treasury, Stephen Kennedy. That was able to provide the states a wider view of the macroeconomy. Again, states, basically in a federation like Australia, the macroeconomy is more handled by the federal government because we have the biggest, the hands on the biggest levers that affect the national economy. But the states are very willing, and this happened again when I was Head of Treasury in both the Commonwealth and New South Wales. The Commonwealth forecasts and the Commonwealth assessments of the national economy and how it's going are very useful to the states. What leaders are able to divine from that is, if that's the national economy and the views of both the Reserve Bank Governor and the Head of Treasury, then they can apply them to what they are seeing in their own states. They have other sources of data. With respect to employment, for example, they can look at their payroll tax data. So they will again be getting different signals from different data points that can provide and assist in complementing the statistics collected by the federal government. But it's also useful for leaders to understand, for example, the June national accounts saw GDP decrease by 7%. We have seen that information comes out quarterly. We have seen three, I think now, monthly indicators of the labour force. And the last one was, in fact, quite positive, showing that jobs lost early in the COVID episode across the country, about 50% have been recovered. So it gives everyone a picture of, again, in the COVID sense, how the health settings are going. And again, I think we need to remind ourselves, in 7 out of the 8 jurisdictions in Australia, the COVID situation is very good. The situation in Victoria is improving, not quite daily, but the trend figures are going very well. So there's still some numbers bouncing around, but everything is looking on the right trajectory or the right path. So I think for leaders to have that input, again, from the experts who can advise National Cabinet, providing them that national view which they can apply then to their own economy, their own circumstances, again, is very useful.
Can I just, acknowledging the significant changes to the Australian economy and the risk landscape during the course of 2020, we had some evidence on Tuesday from Peter Jennings, Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and we're exploring the question of a survey and a mapping of the strategy that takes a longer view beyond just the immediacy of this year and next, but takes out to 5 and 10 years and gets a sense of the risk horizon and then what the strategy will be on a whole of government basis to manage those risks. His impression was that there was not an overarching strategic policy framework within the Australian government arrangements that would undertake that exercise. Is that your understanding, Mr. Gaetjens? And if that's right, how might that be changed, and will it be changed?
we have Home Affairs, I think, as the department that probably has the most, the closest structural fit to looking at both strategy and operational elements of disasters. But I wouldn't just rely on one piece of that structure. If you have a look at a pandemic, health would be looking at things in terms of even what the World Health Organization is doing. So people are keeping their eye on factors that exist in their own portfolios. Prime Minister and Cabinet itself can coordinate disaster preparedness. There's the disaster preparedness framework that we have.
Indeed.
So I think we need to look at, again, in my original evidence, it's the objectives, purpose and governance just as much as the architectural or structural arrangements. I'm not convinced that you will necessarily get a better and more durable solution by setting up an independent structure, because once you set up structures, you quite often inhibit conversations beyond that structure with stovepiping or other things. So I think in terms of dealing with strategy, it's very useful to be able to bring together within the Commonwealth those relevant bodies through either task force or ongoing meetings or through the convening that PM&C has by its nature to deal with the particular issues as they arise. But that would not prevent anyone, I think, looking at timescales of 5, 10, 20 years to say what is expected, what is the data showing us, to the extent that the data can give you an accurate estimation of what might happen. It's probably at that timescale much better looking at scenarios and again getting the experts from Bureau of Meteorology who can tell you, again, their long-term forecasting at the moment I think goes out 3 months. Beyond that, they just don't have the ability to see where some of the driving forces of world weather and the ability to forecast that, the information is just not there.
So I'll just take you up on two aspects of that. Just on the latter point, of course, the evidence of Peter Jennings was directed not just to climate risks or weather risks that might trigger natural disasters, but other kinds of risks, be they geopolitical risks or economic shocks and others. As I understand it, the existing mechanisms within government are things like the Australian Government Crisis Coordinating Committee, the Secretaries Committee. Those are the kinds of and task forces that might be set up from time to time, such as, for example, the National Resilience Task Force. Are those measures enough to really bring together all of the knowledge and information and insights within government to deal with all of those risks in a comprehensive way?
Councillor, I would add to that the very high level, and I would say top of the tree with respect to strategy within the Commonwealth Public Service is the Secretaries Committee on National Security. And while it has a name, Secretaries Committee on National Security, it will look at the Secretary of Home Affairs as a member of that. So he will be looking at the disaster lens of a nation. We have Defence, Foreign Affairs that can look at geopolitical other issues. We have the intelligence agencies. So that is the very high level strategic focus. And of course, when events come out either at global or regional level, we could also bring in, again, in a pandemic situation, we can bring in the Secretary of Health who can look in, to add that knowledge base to the wider strategic framework and policy direction that we would address at that level. That then feeds up into the National Security Committee of Federal Cabinet.
Right. Could I take you then from those insights to circumstances where the Commonwealth would need to respond to an emergency that is of such a national scale that all the Commonwealth's resources and assistance that can be brought to bear and leadership becomes necessary, part of that response. In the Commonwealth's response to the propositions in Part C concerning the power to declare a national emergency, the Commonwealth called for a constitutional referral of powers from the states to give effect to the Commonwealth's national emergency response. What was contemplated to be captured by that referral, and to what end, Mr. Gaetjens?
So I can best summarise the reason for that in the Commonwealth's, it's in your document, I think it is Commonwealth 900.001.000. Let me get to the 2. And I just refer you to a sentence that says, the Commonwealth wishes to ensure the resources of the nation can be harnessed and applied in appropriate, proportionate and equitable ways to secure the safety and relief from suffering of all Australians. We do so with recognition that collectively we will face more frequent and intense natural disasters in the future. Council, the purpose of declaring a national emergency is such that there can be readiness and the ability to act quickly, depending on what the situation is, from Commonwealth actions that could arise from its own powers under the Constitution, its own existing legislation. But there could also be events unknown at the moment, or because they transcend states. For example, there could be issues that go to affecting supply chains across the country. So the Commonwealth has a head of power in the Constitution that relates to trade and commerce, but that is not, I think, a single responsibility of the Commonwealth. So, as the Constitution has powers relating to both the states and the Commonwealth, I think for the purposes of being ready to respond quickly, to have an emergency declaration that has referrals of powers from states, and I emphasise that referrals of powers will be a negotiation between the Commonwealth and the state to look at those subjects or matters that powers would be referred. If that provided an ongoing situation where, looking at, again, as the Commonwealth said, with clear thresholds of how and when such a declaration should be triggered, that triggering event would happen, and immediately there could be action that could address Commonwealth own power actions as well as state powers that have been referred to the Commonwealth to act. It looks, I think, to provide that appropriate and collective action that can actually respond, rather than rely on goodwill or having the need to negotiate to get outcomes to act. Again, I think we can look from the responses to COVID-19 and the bushfires to say, we don't want governments to talk together to do something, we want them to do something. And there's very little differentiation then between state, local or federal government. It's, will someone just please do something?
Yes.
And I think, given the expectation that there are going to be more frequent events, I think now is the time, looking at both the experience from the bushfires last summer as well as COVID, that we take the opportunity now to put in place enduring arrangements that will allow quick action. And again, that is fitting, I think, and with the Prime Minister's own words, that is a clear line of sight, I think, to community expectation.
Also from the Commonwealth's response, it does allow for, though, there to be a process of consultation and, if necessary, negotiation, but that's in relation to the making of the declaration. Is that right, Mr. Gaetjens?
There are two aspects of that, Council. One is with respect to making of the declaration, which would include a referral of powers. The second is the bringing that emergency declaration into effect. In the Commonwealth submission, we refer to a two-key approach.
Yes.
And what that would allow, if you had a situation where there was, again, an event that affected more than one state, or an event that was actually a huge event in one particular state where the resources of that state might not be capable of managing that event, the Commonwealth could take the position, we think this is of such a scale and needing such a quick response that we will invoke the emergency declaration. The two-key approach then provides the opportunity for the state government to say, well, we agree with that or we do not agree with that. That then sets up a clear and transparent position of both Commonwealth and state governments. And I think that sets a very clear position of, if there's a difference of opinion between the two governments, those opinions are very clear and transparent, and people can make judgments about which is right and how to respond to that particular event.
Mr. Gaetjens.
I think it is setting up a capability to do something, but it does not bind the states into agreeing to that. So the states do have a position, one, with respect to referral of powers, and two, with respect to whether they think they should turn their key.
Mr. Gaetjens, I'll just have shown what we can see here. I think it's now being broadcast. The extract from the Commonwealth's principal submission, which deals with this issue and identifies that two-key process. It speaks to a legislated national emergency declaration would, in the Commonwealth's view, help to address the challenges faced by the nation, including by facilitating Commonwealth coordination and contribution to emergency response. And here we have the reference to two-key. In the usual case, states and territories would be engaged and their agreement sought in a two-key process to determine that such a declaration was necessary. And may I understand that that would be consultation between the Prime Minister and the First Minister of the state or territory, or states or territories, if there's more than one impacted. That's right, Mr. Jake Gaetjens.
Councillor, it could be the premiers and prime ministers and chief ministers. It could be emergency ministers, but I think for an event like this, it would not surprise me at all that it actually happened between leaders.
All right. Can I ask you about the second aspect? It says, but the Commonwealth must retain the option to act unilaterally to make such a declaration in the national interest where the nature of the impending disaster is beyond the capability of the states and territories to manage. Am I right in understanding there that the decision-making process would not be two key, or there would not be two steps to it? It would be a unilateral act, but it would be premised on there having already been referred the powers that of the states that would be necessary to give full range of response to the Commonwealth.
Council, that would be my understanding. I would also add the Commonwealth does refer to clear thresholds of how and when such a declaration should be triggered.
Yes.
One other approach could be to have one level of a threshold for the two-key process and then another level of a threshold for a unilateral process.
All right. Does the Commonwealth have any plans to take what it has proposed to the Royal Commission, to take that proposal to the states and territories for consultation? That is, I'll put it a different way, Mr. Gaetjens. Is it intended to await? Is this something that is being initiated immediately, and so that work can get underway in seeking a way forward that will deal with this issue, or is it proposed to await the Royal Commission's consideration?
Council, the Commonwealth has responded to the Royal Commission's propositions, and I think it has said it has tried to be as clear as direct as it possibly can be to assist the Royal Commission in coming to its recommendations. I could imagine discussion with the states are now aware of these proposals, but in coming to a final position, my sense would be that the Commonwealth would await the Royal Commission's report. It set the Royal Commission up to look at exactly these types of things, but I think the opportunity was afforded to the Commonwealth to provide its view with respect to your propositions. The response took that up, and now I think we have the opportunity to, again, consult further with the states and territories on these issues, but also to take into account the Royal Commission's final recommendations.
Thank you, Mr. Gaetjens, and we thank you for the feedback and information that the Commonwealth has given to Council Assisting and to the Commission in relation to this term of reference. Commissioners, I'm proposing to ask Mr. Colvin some questions now. Is there any?
No, I think that has been a good summary. There will be a couple of questions. I think we might do it now.
Yes.
And I just want to add some context to the appropriate level of decision-making body, Mr. Gaetjens, just so you know where the Commission's coming from. And I'm sure those that have been watching would brief you, but there's two areas of concern that we've had is that decisions be made at the appropriate level with the authority and the accountability for that level of decision. But what we've seen so far in the process is the decision making from a strategic point, policy and the like is timeliness, and it seems that decisions get bogged down at a lower level and try to get resolved by consensus. And so national warnings, I think, is one where 16 years from initial recommendation in 2004 to get to a point where we are today, where it still hasn't been accepted by a high authority, but it's we're close to being there. So it's a timeliness sense, and then in an operational sense, the process assumes that Commonwealth resources are infinite at the moment. So it doesn't take into account that there's finite resources and there could be competing priorities out there. And so every time we ask someone about this point where you get to this finite set of resources, competing priorities, how is a decision made? It immediately dropped to, well, we'll make it in accordance with our jurisdiction and that's it. And so that we're trying to look at, and that's where the declarations, I understand from Council, going to try and resolve an issue that Commissioners have addressed on what the appropriate process may be to unblock in a very tight area the decision making so that it's actually raised to the appropriate authority with the accountability as quickly as it can to resolve something and be able to move on. Not that the National Cabinet would get hands-on moving, in my parlance, tanks around a battlefield or fire trucks around a battlefield. Nothing from that. It's the appropriate level of authority and accountability. So you've actually helped us with talking about national security mechanism, for example, today, and the like on how decisions and accountabilities are made there. So I'll go to Commissioner Bennett. She has a couple of questions on declaration, I think.
No, well, I actually had my main question, funnily enough, follows straight from yours, Chair, because that was exactly where I was going. I think from what you said, you don't, obviously the bulk of the resources used to deal with natural disasters are state resources, in an operational sense, and they're there for the states to deal with. But when you're looking at a national scale of disaster, eventually there may be questions of prioritisation. Oh, sorry. That was me. I thought I'd turned it off. Questions of prioritisation. So the Commonwealth doesn't have control of the state resources. So you've got questions, of course, of the states controlling their own resources and deciding where they go intra-jurisdictionally in the states. And there may be, and of course we know that there's a lot of coordination discussion that takes place at cost level in particular of states helping each other out. But when you get a national scale disaster, there might be questions of national picture and national priority. The Commonwealth does have resources that it brings to play to assist, and the Commonwealth has its own resources, and primarily apart from strategic and public service assistance, you've got the Commonwealth has the ADF. So if the Commonwealth has to then make decisions about the prioritisation of Commonwealth resources, the allocation of Commonwealth resources in such a national scale disaster, do you see that decision making taking place at a national cabinet level, or do you see that taking place at a different level, a ministerial level? I was just curious as to where you would see that decision taking place, the discussion about it and the decision of the allocation of what are not sufficient Commonwealth resources to go around.
Commissioner, I would venture that there would be a discussion at operational level as well, because people would see activity on the ground and make judgments or decisions about what equipment, assets, resources are required to handle those events. You would then have discussions that seek to prioritise those if the nature of the event exceeds the number of resources or amount of resources made available. You're right, I think that the bulk of the assets and equipment goes to the states. Commonwealth would be able to step in to assist with funding things. I'm not convinced it would be useful for the Commonwealth to buy things itself. I think it can help with funding things that the states would keep. But with respect to the ADF, the allocation and decisions made about where the ADF go is one for the Commonwealth. But what National Cabinet has done and what could happen in other events is that there can be discussions between the states and territories at the appropriate level about the prioritisation. So what is the nature of the event that causes the greatest priority for resources to go to a particular place? Then there would then be a discussion, I think, with the Commonwealth for the ADF. Well, these are the priorities. Yes, we have adequate resources to be able to attend that particular event. And in fact, what is happening at the moment with the ADF has been on call, if you like, and attending events in Australia since January this year, whether it be bushfire, whether it be assisting with COVID, and it is now getting into readiness to prepare for this upcoming disaster season. So it has to manage its assets and is now looking at priorities and saying amongst those priorities, for example, what do we give the highest priority to? Helping the management of state borders or helping quarantine to allow more Australians to come back home? So that is a decision of the Commonwealth, but it would take into account state and territory input to what they think their priorities are.
I guess my question, though, Mr. Gaetjen, was going at what level would that discussion take place? Do you think, in the disaster area, would that be a National Cabinet decision informed? We heard from Professor Murphy that he would bring to National Cabinet the integrated views of the AHPPC, having taken all of the operational views and the Chief Health Ministers, and he then was able to brief National Cabinet on that consolidated collegial decision and then inform National Cabinet so National Cabinet could make decisions about national resources. I was just wondering whether the same sort of thing could apply. So is it National Cabinet that then decides how those resources should be allocated in a case of competing priorities in the same mechanism, or do you see that just being, and I don't mean just in a negative sense, but being more at the level of ADF and operational people at the state level? Or is it rather a decision for the First Ministers who look at the questions from the whole of the state perspective, perhaps, and the Prime Minister in a National Cabinet context?
Commissioner, again, I think it would depend on the actual circumstances, but knowing also that defence has people posted to, and I don't know the exact title, but states have crisis centres or state control centres for events. We have defence in those control centres. They would have then their own view from people who are very experienced in looking at this as to where the priorities look. They would be able to talk amongst themselves. But I think the actual decision would be one for the Minister for Defence and CDF. They are the ones who actually control the Defence Forces. But they would be hearing from their people posted in these centres what the situation on the ground is, their view about what they can do, and therefore how they can get resources from X to Y or allocate resources that are already at Y. And this goes to the view that Defence themselves can take, as was done in the bushfire, to actually pre-position assets and people where they think they're going to be most needed. So I think it would be an iterative process. Again, looking at subsidiarity right down to those people, the defence people on the ground and in the state emergency centres or control centres that are looking at what's going on. And that would also be considered, I'm sure, in the architecture that the EMA in Home Affairs does with the discussion with their state counterparts as well.
Thank you. I'm going to think about, I've got a couple of other questions. I'll just see if the others have any questions while I formulate them, because I've got a couple of questions about the practical utility of a declaration and what it, I mean, I understand, you know, there are a number of symbolic matters. There's a question of the enlivening of Commonwealth resources, if I can call it that, or a notice going out to Commonwealth departments. I'm just trying to get your view on the practical utility of a declaration, and I know that there've been some response to it by the Commonwealth, but I'd be very helpful, because if it's not going, for example, to deal with the allocation of Commonwealth resources necessarily, I'm just trying to work out exactly where you see it having other than symbolic or internal Commonwealth utility.
Shall I address that now?
Might as well.
Yeah,
I said it well. I formulated what I was asking
Yeah,
about.
that's right. She often thinks aloud like that. Can we just, Mr. Gaetjens, can I just confirm your timeline, please?
Sorry.
We don't want to run everything out of time here. Do you have time to answer that, and then us still go to Mr. Colvin?
I'm sure I do, Chair.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
No, happy to assist the Royal Commission. Commissioner, in that respect, again, if my memory, I'm trying to find it on my original contribution. I think I did refer to so paragraph 35 of my initial submission to the Royal Commission. Such a mechanism could be regarded as symbolic in that it signals to the Australian community that an unfolding crisis is extremely serious. So it does then provide a real message. You know,
I'm not suggesting for a moment that there is anything insubstantive in a symbolic aspect. I'm just trying to go from that very important symbolic consequence to practical, you know, just anything in terms of actions.
Yes.
I see the enlivening of, or the message going out to all Commonwealth resources to be ready to do what the Commonwealth can do to support the states and to ready things, but I'm just looking to see what goes.
Yeah, Commissioner.
And I've read that, but I need a bit more light and shade to that, if I may.
Well, it would need to be substantive in the sense that public resources beyond the scope of the single jurisdiction needs to be mobilised. And again, in the Commonwealth's latest submission with respect to the propositions, declare a national emergency backed by legislation with clear thresholds of how and when such a declaration should be triggered, and clear and meaningful powers, responsibility and actions specified.
Yes.
So I guess what I'm saying is the Commonwealth agrees with you that the emergency declarations needs to be such a document that is very clear with respect to why it was declared, and then after it is declared, very substantial and meaningful and direct actions. Now, I can't specify to you now those actions because they would change depending on the nature of the event. They would be different for a tsunami compared to a pandemic, different for other things. But and my final point on this, I don't think it would be simply the mobilisation of resources that would occur after the declaration of an emergency. Pre-positioning could occur beforehand, because you do see events unfolding and you are looking at what can happen, and if it's fire, people will have predictions about where the winds will take and the fuel load will take fires, so people will be taking that into account with respect to mobilising or pre-positioning. But it's then with respect to the Commonwealth, once this declaration is done, it then allows a series of, I think, firmly specified or contemplated actions that show to people this does not just mean here's a message that we need to do something, but it actually provides the basis and gives the legislative basis for specific actions.
Sorry, just to clarify that, are you saying that that there should not be a generic declaration? Sorry, start again. Are you saying that there should be provision for a generic declaration, or are you saying that each declaration should itself contain specificity as to the actions that are going to be taken in consequence of that declaration, which then, of course, may need amendment as conditions change? Is it the former or the latter?
No, I think I would have a view that a declaration would be able to have within it, for a particular event, actions,
I see,
meaningful powers, responsibility that relate to that type of event.
And then it may need amendment if the situation changes that requires further action.
It may.
I understand that. Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Mr. Gaetjens. Appreciate that very much. Ms Hogan-Doran.
Commissioner, just for the benefit of the transcript, Mr Gaetjens' statement to which he made reference is PMC 8002 0001 0001. So that's all I had for Mr Gaetjens at this time, but I'll go to Mr Colvin, which may trigger questions that you want to address to either Mr Colvin or Mr Gaetjens. Mr Colvin, you've been the head of the newly stood up National Bushfire Recovery Agency, and you gave some evidence to us early on in the course of the Royal Commission as to that work. To what extent has the agency been successful to its mission?
Good morning, Council, and good morning, Commissioners. Thank you for the question. That's a really difficult question to answer, of course, because I would suggest that we're in still the early phases of what will be a very long and in some parts slow recovery. We are responding to a notice to give through the Commission in terms of a range of figures and statistics that we'll update. But I think that the agency has been very successful in terms of creating a national picture of the 1920 devastating bushfires, in bringing into effect some national coordination, some stewardship of the relief and recovery. And as you'll see with the statistics, and I'm happy to update the Commissioners with some of that now if you like, yes. We are now just over 12 months since the commencement of the fires. In fact, it's over 12 months to the fires in central Queensland, which has gone, of course, incredibly quickly. But the recovery phase is well underway, and we're largely now transitioning from what we should describe as immediate relief, that is, providing in most part cash support to families, individuals, businesses to stand up and make the decisions they need to make, and transitioning to what will be a very lengthy, long-term recovery process. But Ms Hogan-Doran, I say that with one very clear caveat in my mind. The Commissioners will be interested that even now, 12 months after the fires, charitable services, the states, local governments are reporting new presentations for the first time to seek support of government or non-government sector as a result of the fires. And I think that just underscores recovery is a marathon. That's the word that's been used. It takes time, and it happens at the pace of the individual. It can't be forced on a community. It can't be forced on the individual. But we will give you some updated stats, but just quickly to give you an idea of where recovery is at. As at the end of August, 4,882 properties have been cleaned. across the country, or across the 4 principal jurisdictions. Mostly they are residential. There are some commercial properties in there, and while there are still cleanups occurring, a lot of that now is presentations later in the process, or properties that are difficult to get to, quite frankly. Crossing of creeks or fords that may not be stable, or driveways that are 13, 15 kilometres long in some cases. There's been 297,000 payments to individuals, relief payments, over 26,000 payments to business and primary producers in the form of grants. I know the commissioners have been very interested, and I think rightly it's a concern for all of us, health and well-being of individuals and communities. So to give commissioners a sense of that, there's still 1,700 calls a week, the dedicated lifeline number, and that is steadily increasing. We know that there are 600 presentations a week on either telehealth or face-to-face for support in relation to trauma caused by the bushfires. And we know that there's already 94 grants have gone out to small community groups at a very grassroots level to help them work in their community to do a range of things, from peer-to-peer support networks through to providing just packs that make people feel a little bit better about the situation they find themselves in. More broadly, Ms. Hogan-Doran, the move at the moment is around what does that long-term economic recovery look like, and working across the 4 most heavily impacted jurisdictions. The government announced and collectively with our state partners, joint programs and projects at the local level that will be funded for locally led and locally delivered projects. That is now well underway, and we've seen the first of those announced in South Australia. I'm very hopeful that we'll have some others to announce, which will give the community great hope across the other jurisdictions. And if I might just finish on this point, the overwhelming sentiment that we are seeing in the community at the moment is one of fatigue. Not surprisingly, quite understandable. We are seeing an overwhelming sentiment of anxiety as we approach another high-risk weather season, of course. And as I said before, we're seeing an absolute focus on recovery having to be at the pace of individuals, and it is very individualistic. Ms. Hogan-Doran, the other point I know that the Commission has been interested in, and we'll provide you further details on this when we respond to that notice to give, but we went live yesterday with an interactive map of the country that will give individuals in regions an ability to basically click and play and see what support is available, to see the recovery process, to get a feel for the impact of the fires in their region. I think, again, we'll learn as we roll these types of measures out, but I think that's a big step forward.
Thank you so much for that update, Mr. Colvin. To what extent has these measures in terms of the calls to Lifeline, the fatigue and the anxiety and even the work of your agency been complicated by the COVID-19 pandemic?
I think COVID has complicated just about everything across all walks of life. We know that. I don't want to overstate the complications it's created in terms of bushfire recovery, but of course it has provided challenges. It's required us to find ways with our state and territory partners for recovery to be done in a COVID-safe way. So, for instance, clean-up of properties. Initial planning began in a non-COVID environment. We then need to adjust to a COVID environment. So little things that seem simple, like community meetings, obviously need to be done differently. We know that from a mental health or a health and wellbeing perspective, people have very individual needs and individual desires. So some people respond better to a face-to-face meeting, and that became a little bit more difficult. So telehealth became the principal way of delivering services. But that said, there is still a large number of face-to-face services being provided. So it has added a layer of complexity. It has certainly added a layer of fatigue to the community. But I don't want to overstate that, recovery continues and must continue despite those challenges.
I'll just have Proposition H25 shown by the operator, and while that's being done, I'll just describe for the benefit of the transcript, Mr. Colvin, it proposed a standing national body responsible for natural disaster recovery and resilience at the Australian government level, and it included a number of sub-propositions as to its suggested responsibilities and focus of that organisation. The Commonwealth's response was supportive of this, but identified that the standing body would operate in respect of resilience, relief and recovery. Just a minor question, when it speaks to relief, how is relief different to recovery? Is that capturing that immediate relief that you were describing? Or is it a temporal description, or is it a substantive description or distinction? For example, it's directed to financial relief as opposed to ADF assistance.
All of the above, if I can be unhelpful in that way. But if you imagine a continuum, and it depends, of course, on the particular disaster or what we might be dealing with. But relief could be everything from ensuring that there's petrol available for people to run generators and that there's fresh water for people to drink in the immediate 24 hours after a cyclone has hit or a fire has gone through to getting those immediate payments into families' pockets to help them buy food and groceries.
Right.
It's difficult to draw distinctions, and I'm very strongly of the view that it is impossible for government or our partners to draw a line and say, well, we've finished with the response, we're now into relief, or we're now into long-term recovery. It's not like that. And the Commonwealth response in relation to this is to try and give effect to understand that we see this as a continuing proposition across a continuum. In my view, recovery starts before the disaster has hit the community. We need to be thinking about what will recovery need to entail, what will relief need to entail, even before a disaster has hit a community. And that really gets the elements of resilience as well.
In order to deliver those kind of immediate relief measures, such as ensuring water supply and food supplies, particularly in floods or cyclone or tsunami circumstances, or where there's been, for example, even mass casualty events and there's a need to coordinate the delivery of medical assistance. The Commonwealth's response concerning the referral of powers was directed to just the question of the declaration. Is it anticipated that the Commonwealth would be able to, through such an agency, deliver all it would need to by way of measures of relief from its existing suite of powers, or would it need also a referral of state powers to be able to give effect to this immediate response relief?
A good question. I think the issue is one of clarity, and in a time of crisis, you want absolute clarity of role and authority.
Yep.
We saw in the immediate aftermath of the bushfires, the ADF deploy and provide a great deal of support in terms of that immediate relief, providing fresh water, providing fuel, providing safe shelter and food and kitchen facilities. I think the Commonwealth and the ADF did a remarkable job to deploy that as quickly as they did. But of course, and you've heard evidence, and this is before my time in this agency, of course, you've heard evidence of, was that process as clear? Were the states very clear in their own mind of what resource was available and what capacity and capability existed at the Commonwealth level to deploy? So I think the concept of a national declaration, from my perspective, doesn't just pre-position resources and deal with the response. It does also have a tangible effect in that immediate relief and, in some ways, longer-term recovery as well.
Are there? In what way could this agency have established work to be complementary but not replace the roles and responsibilities for recovery that are at a state and local government level?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is great scope, well designed, for an agency at the Commonwealth level, at the national level, to bring a lot of value to this space. And again, speaking from my experience, but also from my colleagues in the North Queensland Flood and National Drought Agency, and also what we've seen in the COVID Commission, you don't want to be trying to make arrangements while actually dealing with a disaster. You want to have those well embedded, understood and in place so that they can be rolled out when they need to be as quickly and as efficiently as possible. So ensuring that we've got a consistent view of what measures are available, ensuring that we've got a consistent view of the guidelines that we need across the country to roll out a measure, or a consistent view on our delivery and implementation mechanisms. I think it would be a large role for an agency at the national level to bring clarity and coordination to.
How would you describe that agency could address issues of resilience? So it's not just relief and recovery, but long-term resilience. How could that best be affected through such an agency?
So I think resilience has multiple levels, of course, but the experience of the bushfires, as well as more recently, the drought and other events, tells us that resilience needs to be seen end to end, as I've already said, but also needs to be seen nationally as well. So we have a large number, and you mentioned 70,000 pages worth of documents have been submitted to you. I'm sure resilience is mentioned in a lot of those documents in a variety of ways, in frameworks, in various arrangements. Speaking personally from my perspective now and my observations over the last 9 months, I can't point to a single national framework that both incentivises and prioritises resilience in our recovery, in our relief, in our response operations. And we've seen that through our work through the MBRA, that for instance, you would have heard a lot about the DRFA, the Disaster Recovery Funding Arrangements. It is a funding mechanism between the Commonwealth and the states, but I feel it is often misinterpreted as a framework for recovery and resilience. It doesn't incentivise, it doesn't prioritise resilience or building back better in the way that I think as a country we should. So again, this is where I believe that an agency at the national level can bring a lot of influence to bear, the convening power of the Commonwealth to bring not just our government partners, but our non-government partners, charitable sector, the philanthropic sector are a big part, they have a big role to play. I think is where at a national level we can do a great deal of good.
And should that agency be right within the centre of government and plugged into all measures?
Absolutely. And again, my experience over the last 9 months is that I've had to call on all parts of government at different stages to bring to bear what I think needs to be done to effect recovery.
Thank you, Mr. Colvin. Commissioners?
No, I think that was a great summary right at the end there for that question. Commissioner Bennett? Commissioner McIntosh?
Nothing for me.
No, I think that's been good. Ms Hogan-Doran?
Nothing more from me then, Chair.
Nothing more from you?
No.
Perfect. Mr Gaetjens, thank you. Mr Colvin, thank you, and good luck with the ongoing recovery activities as we head into the next disaster season. So we appreciate the efforts of you and your team. So thank you very much. Gentlemen, you're both released from your summons. Noting Mr Gaetjens, we'll get those answers from you this afternoon, please, on those outstanding topics.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Commissioners.
Thank you. Ms Hogan-Doran, anything else this morning?
Nothing more for today, Chair.
We'll adjourn and we'll reconvene at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning for the last hearing day. Thank you.
My God.